Okay, so yeah, this is joint work with my colleagues from Technische Universität Darmstadt and Uni of Duisburg-Essen. And CATT is our defense against rowhammer attacks, which are actually a pretty new and scary class of attacks. So computer systems consist of a hardware and a software layer, and both hardware and the software contain vulnerabilities. And these bugs allow an adversary to attack and take control over the system at runtime. And while exploiting hardware bugs normally requires physical presence, software attacks exploit memory corruption vulnerabilities in the code, and this can usually be done completely remotely. So in this case, rowhammer attacks are actually special because they exploit a hardware bug which can be triggered from software. And this class of attacks actually requires no vulnerabilities in the code. So typically, modern software already deploys some form of access control, and this is usually supported by a memory configuration, in this case represented by a bit that is set to 1. Sorry. In the rowhammer scenario, the attacker accesses the software while all deployed access control mechanisms are active, and then by repeatedly accessing vulnerable memory, the attacker can flip a bit in neighboring memory such that the access control policy, in this case, is deactivated. And there are two important aspects. First, in this scenario, first, the attacker-controlled memory is co-located to the bit physically that we actually manipulated here. And second, the attacker never accesses the bit itself, right? It is modified just by accessing a location that is close to it. And this process of repeatedly accessing vulnerable memory is called hammering, and allows to completely bypass all the deployed software isolation mechanisms and compromise the entire system. Now, the high-level idea of our approach is actually to extend the access control with a physical isolation policy to mitigate rowhammer purely in software. So with our defense in place, we prevent exploitation of the underlying hardware bug by avoiding physical co-location, and hence the attacker can touch this. So to understand how our defense works, we need to take a closer look at the rowhammer vulnerability. The attack targets DRAM hardware, which is highly standardized and widely available as off-the-shelf components. And here you can see a typical example of such a component, which is called a dual inline memory module. And this form factor is typically found in desktops and server machines. For laptops and smartphones, the modules might be a little bit smaller, but the presented logical architecture is actually similar for all DRAM modules. In particular, these modules consist of a number of ranks, which in this case correspond actually to the front and the back side of the module that is here. And each rank consists of a number of chips. And here we can see that there are 8 chips, these black little chips, on the rank on each side. So basically for each rank we have 8 chips. And each chip in turn contains a small number of banks, which hold the contents of the memory, and we will see that a little bit later. But I mean, the question is, how can we actually store individual bits electronically? And basically, we only need 2 components for that. So we need a capacitor, which acts as the electrical storage, and then we also need a transistor, which acts as a switch. And we call the line that powers the base of the transistor the select line, and the line for accessing the storage we call data. And the entire unit is then called a memory cell. And we can read a bit that is stored in the capacitor simply by powering the select line, which switches the transistor to the on state, and then we can transfer the bit from the capacitor through the data line. Now, storing an individual bit is not itself very useful. Hence, we can arrange these individual memory cells in a matrix, like here. And this structure that you see now is actually exactly a bank. So before you saw the black chips on the DRAM module, and each of these chips contains a number of these banks. So in a bank, the neighboring cells reside in columns, in different columns, and the adjacent cells reside in different rows. And the banks are always accessed via a dedicated row buffer, and that row buffer stores the content of the row that is read, and it is also used to communicate the contents of the memory to the processor through the memory bus. So to access a row, we power the select line of all the memory cells in a row. This transfers the bit from all the memory cells into the row buffer through their data lines. And the row buffer stores the bits of the row. We then send them, or the row buffer then sends out the memory contents to the system. And as you may have noticed in the individual bit case, the read operation is actually destructive because we drain the charge from the capacitors. And so this operation actually requires a write back, which is also simply called a refresh. And in the refresh operation, the contents of the memory row are rewritten from the row buffer. So the original value that is stored in the row buffer is written back to the row 2 in this case. I mean, yeah, this all seems to work fine, right? But we use these components all the time in our laptops and servers. But it also looks fairly complex. So one might actually ask the question, how reliable is this mechanism? And this is exactly what Kim et al. Did in 2014 when they presented a actually very simple code for testing DRAM hardware by accessing it from software. So this is the assembly instructions that you see. In this code, you read memory from two addresses, which we call X and Y. And then afterwards, we immediately flush these addresses to evict them from the processor cache. And upon repeating the procedure, this will result in each memory access to go directly to the DRAM hardware rather than being cached in the processor. And I mean, for testing the DRAM hardware, this is actually necessary, right? Otherwise, we don't go to the DRAM module, actually. It won't actually see the accesses if we don't do the flush. Now, finally, to actually hit the same bank, these two addresses need to be exactly 8 megabytes apart. This is the general pattern that Kim et al. Specified in their paper. And yeah, obviously, in order to test this, we want addresses to be in the same bank. So the result looks something like this. Here, the addresses X and Y correspond to the aggressor rows 3 and 7, which you can see in red. And running the testing code repeatedly causes activation of these two aggressor rows. And after a while, surprisingly, what you see is that individual memory cells in adjacent rows actually change their value. And yeah, why is this an unexpected result? Quite simply because we never access these memory cells. So this is actually called rowhammer. This is the rowhammer effect. Unfortunately, Kim et al. Found that these bit flips are not sporadic or isolated events, but can actually be reproduced. And when we execute the testing code, we can actually also find very many different locations in a module. So they observed for different architectures and different modules over various manufacturers, they observed more than 10,000 bit flips, and this was on 2 gigabyte DRAM modules. So today we even have bigger modules. So you might say that these bit flips are precisely why everybody tells you to actually buy the good ECC RAM, right, which is a little bit more expensive, and you have the feeling that you really invest something and you should gain something like security. In this case, once it's bad, it actually gets a bit worse because the subsequent studies and publications found that the number of bit flips per row can actually increase significantly when we perform something which is called a double-sided rowhammer. And in this scenario, the attacker chooses the aggressor rows in such a way that there is a single victim row between two attacker rows. And this reliably produces multiple bit flips within a single row, and hence defeats ECC RAM. Now, how dangerous are these bit flips? I mean, what could possibly go wrong if you flip a single bit? It's probably safe to say that the single control bit flip is actually devastating for system security. And there have been a number of studies. One early study is from 2009, and this is only a selected list of publications. And in 2012 we saw an Intel patent actually filed, where you can see that in the Intel in the patent application there's the name rowhammer. Nobody really knew what that meant. Only the people in Intel, I guess. And in 2014, we saw the original rowhammer study by Kim et al. And then in 2015, we saw the first attack. So there's actually two attacks here. There's a kernel attack and a sandbox escape for Google Chrome, which was conducted by researchers from Google. In 2016, we saw a number of different attacks, and also for different platforms, and also in the remote case. So yeah, this is actually dangerous. For this reason, manufacturers and also the research community immediately started thinking about defenses, and one solution that seems obvious is to avoid simply using broken DRAM hardware. As I said before, sadly, this is not something that you can attach, a property that you can attach to an individual manufacturer. It actually seems to be a design problem because all the manufacturers are actually affected. And additionally, it might not even be possible to simply change the DRAM modules because, for instance, in smartphones, they are soldered to the motherboard. So that's not that simple. But one proposal was to prohibit the CF-flash instruction, which we needed in the testing code, if you remember. Unfortunately, this was proven ineffective. So manufacturers also said we could increase the refresh intervals, which would be nice because it wouldn't require any hardware changes. Unfortunately, this was also proven to be ineffective. So then there was a software defense by Avike et al. In 2016, where they proposed to use hardware performance counters to detect a rowhammer attack, because rowhammer attacks typically create a high cache miss rate. And the problem is that this is a heuristic approach and creates actually some runtime overhead and also suffers from false positives. Finally, Kim et al. Also proposed to modify the memory controller implementation and to deliberately refresh adjacent rows in a bank with some configurable probability, which they call simply P. And P can be configured, for instance, in the BIOS, I think. The problem here is that this modifies hardware, and this is quite costly. Takes a lot of time to deploy, and also actually creates a legacy problem, because how are we going to patch the systems in production today? So when we started thinking about defenses, we first looked at the assumptions that rowhammer actually makes. So in particular, the rowhammer adversary assumes two things. First, the existence of vulnerable memory cells, and second, the possibility of physical collocation with attacker-controlled memory. And interestingly, we found that you can tackle both of these assumptions separately. So in our initial approach, we tried to simply deactivate the vulnerable memory locations. And our goal here was to deactivate them in such a way that they could never be used by the system at runtime. Therefore, we built a prototype for such a blacklisting approach to deactivate the vulnerable rows during the boot time. And for our blacklisting approach, we first need to identify vulnerable cells in an offline analysis phase. And this can be done using existing tools. For instance, there's a rowhammer test in memtest, I think, which you can use. And we modified some of the tools slightly to compile a list of such vulnerable locations. And we then patched the popular open source bootloader grub to actually disable the respective memory if we give it such a list during boot. And then as a consequence, the vulnerable rows are not available to the operating system. because the bootloader loads the operating system, and the operating system initializes the memory from the memory list that it is given. So because the memory is not available to the operating system, it can also not be allocated by the memory allocator, and hence the vulnerable locations cannot be exploited. For the details on this approach, I refer you to our full technical report, which is available online, where we also explain in great detail the different drawbacks. So because this blacklisting approach actually has some problems as well, in particular regarding the coverage of analyzed memory. The first problem is the spatial coverage, because the testing tools themselves run on the target system, right? So they require a bit amount of memory to actually execute the test, and this memory that is occupied by the testing tools can never really be tested. So there's a spatial coverage problem. The second problem is the temporal coverage, because one could imagine that the DRAM modules wear out after some time, and that the number of vulnerable locations actually increases. So you could imagine this easily, because there are already papers which show that the number of DRAM errors increases with the temperature. So if you use a heat lamp and point it to your DRAM modules, you get actually errors. So currently, there's simply not enough information available about this wearing out or the development of vulnerable cells over time, and it's definitely necessary to conduct further research to assess this. Finally, the memory overhead of the blacklisting might simply be too high for systems which have a lot of vulnerable cells. For our systems, this was actually feasible, but there might be different cases. For this reason, we designed a generic software-only defense, which we called CATT. And CATT is actually the first defense that leveraged spatial isolation of the system's DRAM. So we showed that this can be done purely in software and is completely transparent to the applications. For this, CATT defines and manages different security domains on the platform, and we then associate an allocated memory area with its designated security domain and enforce a physical isolation policy to prevent the exploitation of bit flips. We implemented a prototype of CATT for the Linux kernel and extensively tested and evaluated this on several machines that we found in our lab to be susceptible to rowhammer. And yeah, so the more detailed design idea is with CATT, we wanted to really isolate the different security domains physically in the DRAM memory. So for this, we need to make our memory allocator aware of the underlying DRAM structure and also of this security domain. So you can see in this case we defined two domains, A and B, which correspond to the user mode and the kernel mode in our prototype. And CATT then tracks for each domain where an allocation request originated from. So if we get a request from domain A, the memory allocator dedicates a certain area of the DRAM to this domain. And if the second domain now makes a request, the allocator leaves a blank space, like a buffer space between the two areas, such that they cannot physically interfere. And it's important to note that this strategy does not prevent bit flips. So you will still see bit flips, but the adversary cannot flip bits in a security domain other than herself. I mean, how can we achieve this exactly? We already know that rowhammer exploits physical collocation in the DRAM module, but CATT is a software defense, and software accesses DRAM memory only through an abstraction, namely this physical address space. In particular, the closest the kernel actually gets to DRAM is by referring to physical addresses which locate these individual memory pages, and the physical address space is actually structured linearly. So this is what you see here in blue. But we somehow need to translate this into the physical DRAM structure, which is really the space where the physical collocation is exploited. So how do these cells and rows and banks relate to the physical addresses of the system? And the answer is there's a semi-random mapping between physical addresses and the DRAM structure, which is implemented by the memory controller. And this mapping distributes the linear physical addresses onto the DRAM structure. And it is semi-randomly distributed, seemingly for performance reasons. So this is not with security in mind, it's simply to optimize for performance. So the important point here is that if we know this DRAM mapping, we can actually tell where a certain page will be located physically in the DRAM. And while these mapping functions may not always be publicly documented, there are existing methodologies and tools to reverse this mapping function. And for the most prevalent architectures, the mapping has been reversed previously. So in our implementation of CATT, we built a prototype of this for testing our approach in the Linux kernel. And we started our work sometime around last year, I think in the summer. And we were using the most recent kernel version at the time, which is version 4.6. So as I said before, our changes are completely transparent to the applications. We don't require any changes to any of the programs. And we modified the physical page allocator in the kernel to associate individual page frames with a security domain tag. We additionally added a dedicated kernel zone to the body allocator to partition the DRAM. So in our evaluation, we used 3 different machines from our lab, which we found to be susceptible to the rowhammer bug. And we conducted a series of experiments and extensive testing, which also took several days, actually. In particular, we tested an Ivy Bridge desktop PC and a Sandy Bridge desktop and a Sandy Bridge laptop device. And all of these had similar memory configurations with the DDR3 DRAM modules installed. And as you may be able to see, we tried to make sure that nobody tampers with the machines during that time, because we also left them open like this. So we conducted our security analysis by testing our approaches, the bootloader blacklisting and our generic defense CATT against the existing rowhammer kernel exploits. And in our results, we found that the In our results, we found that the blacklisting is actually successful. So the rowhammer exploit no longer worked when we gave it this list of vulnerable rows to blacklist, because they were no longer available for the exploited runtime, and hence it could not be exploited. And we also verified that the exploit was successful against our systems with the vanilla kernel for the CATT approach. We then repeated the procedure several times, and usually the exploit would succeed within a couple of minutes. Finally, we installed the modified kernel onto these machines and tested it again against the rowhammer exploit, and found that after running for more than 2 days, essentially the exploit was all the time retrying to allocate memory and exploit the bit flips, and it was unsuccessful. So we simply stopped it after 2 days, actually more than 2 days. We also thoroughly evaluated our approach against several popular performance benchmark suits, and you can see that these are the numbers for CATT only, because the blacklisting approach does not cause any runtime overhead. I mean, we simply remove memory, and there's really no runtime interference. Then we used benchmark suits like SPEC for conducting userland benchmarks and to measure computational workload, and for ONNX to measure the file system latency, I/O performance, and throughput, and also several popular applications which are embedded in the benchmarking suite. And then finally, LMBench to conduct micro benchmarks and collect timings on the cache, accesses and the memory, the system call latency, and so on. All these low-level details. Essentially, what you can see is that regardless if we looked at the computational overhead or memory-intensive benchmarks, there's not really any runtime overhead visible. And in fact, we attribute most of the numbers that you can see to measuring inaccuracies. And while this might seem a bit surprising at first, it's important to remember that we did not actually really introduce any major changes in the performance critical paths of the kernel. We just partitioned the DRAM in such a way that memory that belongs to the kernel is never physically adjacent to userland memory. So we also tested this against several system stress tests and found no deviations from the behavior of a vanilla kernel. So to conclude, sorry. Yeah, everybody loves animated GIFs. So to conclude, the software vulnerabilities are still the predominant attack vector, and as conducting a ROM attack seems to be actually a significant investment for the attacker. And when compared to traditional memory corruption-based exploitation, this is actually a quite big investment. So to the best of my knowledge, we haven't seen any ROM attacks in the wild so far. But I mean, that doesn't mean that they don't exist. Of course, there's also a continuing arms race between attacks and defenses, and at some point you could imagine that in theory memory corruption-based exploit are completely prevented by all the existing defenses because we get super amazing tools for static analysis or formal verification. And while I don't think this is very likely in the near-term future, you could imagine this. And even in that case, ROM attacks would still be able to exploit these systems, and then they would be the only way actually of, or besides memory corruption, the only way to attack these systems at runtime. The good news is that we actually have some promising research results regarding rowhammer, and yeah, also software-only defenses that protect computer systems and also legacy systems against rowhammer. So I'm happy to take your questions.
Kevin Bogalcha, USENIX Barbara. I'm wondering, are you going to make this open source? I mean, this seems to be like one of the things that I'm sure a lot of the community wants to poke at to see if they can find vulnerabilities in there.
Yeah, sure. So we actually thought about this in the beginning, and we would like to make something open source there. Ideally, we would like to contribute something like this to the Linux kernel, right? Because this would be really amazing if you can just configure it and say, I want this, and then it is in the kernel. The problem is that we didn't get a lot of positive feedback about this approach. So there was a discussion on the Linux kernel hardening mailing list, for instance, and essentially it was met by the emperor himself with a statement saying something like, yeah, there's nothing saying you can actually do to defend against rowhammer. And so that's quite hard.
But I mean, you can still make it open source on like GitHub regardless.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't have to be part of the Linux kernel.
Right.
People
I mean,
apply
yeah,
like other security patches as well.
That's correct. And I think if there's many people who would be interested in that, we could definitely work towards that. You just have to keep in mind that these low-level implementation details might, yeah, it sometimes depends on the memory configuration. And so for popular systems, you can actually make a configuration that works for all of them. But for different configurations, it's really hard. And then it really depends. And when people download it, you don't really know which systems do they have. And then, yeah. But I mean, yeah, generally, if people are interested in that, just write me an email or talk to me after the conference.
All right, thank you.
We probably have time for one quick question.
Nathan Doughton on UPenn. Really cool work. Exciting.
Thanks.
Did you look at separate domains in user space, right? So you split user and kernel and you get that separation.
Right.
Did you look at that at all?
Actually, we did. We have some initial results, but it's not in this paper yet. We're hoping to actually get something done soon. So, yeah.
Okay, let's thank the speaker one more time.